The battlefield was eerily quiet now. The once deafening sounds of war replaced by the crackling of lingering flames and the faint howling of the wind. Amid the icy expanse, Varros and Jon Snow sat side by side, their weapons resting in the frost-covered ground beside them. Exhaustion weighed heavily on both of them, their breaths visible in the cold air. Nearby, Maelstrom and Scourge stood like sentinels, their glowing red eyes fixed on their riders. The dragon's presence was imposing yet protective, their primal bond with Varros and Jon undeniable. Jon, gripping Longclaw, turned to Varros, his face a mixture of confusion and quiet admiration. "It's done," he said, his voice hoarse. "The Night King, the dead. It's over." Varros, still catching his breath, let out a faint, tired chuckle. His fiery eyes, though dimmed, carried a glint of knowing. "Over?" he repeated, shaking his head. "No, Jon Snow, this is just the beginning." Jon frowned, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean? The Night King is gone. The dead are defeated." Varros shifted slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. "The dead may be gone, but the living are far more dangerous. You've seen what power does to men, Jon. What ambition, fear, and greed can do. The battle for survival may be over, but the battle for the future has only just begun." Jon turned to look at Scourge, the dragon's glowing gaze meeting his own for a moment. There was something reassuring in that connection, but the weight of Varros's words made his chest tighten. "What's my part in all of this?" Varros looked at him with an intensity that belied his exhaustion. "You have a part to play in the events to come, Jon Snow, a role only you can fulfill. The Lord of Light has plans for you, and while your path remains unclear, know this: you were not born for peace. You were born for purpose." Before Jon could respond, the distant sound of footsteps and voices reached their ears. Turning toward the approaching figures, they saw Robert Baratheon, Ned Stark, and Daenerys Targaryen, flanked by a small retinue of soldiers, closing in on their position. Behind them, the living forces, victorious and relieved, began to chant a single name: "Varros! Varros! Varros!" The chant spread quickly through the ranks, echoing across the battlefield as the soldiers of Westeros and Essos alike celebrated the sorcerer who had led them to victory. The power of the dragons and the might of old Valyria were on full display, and the sight of the two colossal beasts standing watch over Varros and Jon only added to the reverence. Robert, gripping his warhammer, exchanged a glance with Ned, his expression a mix of awe and unease. "The man commands dragons, Ned," he muttered. "Bloody dragons. And look at them. Those beasts listen to him like hounds to their master." Ned's face was solemn, his thoughts evident in the crease of his brow. "We've witnessed the power of old Valyria, Robert. It saved us today, but it's a power that cannot be controlled. Not by any of us." As they reached Varros and Jon, Daenerys stepped forward, her violet eyes locked on Varros. "You've done what I thought impossible," she said, her voice steady but tinged with unease. "You destroyed the Night King. The living owe you everything." Varros stood slowly, his movements deliberate as he faced Daenerys, Robert, and Ned. "The living owe nothing," he said, his voice calm but resonant. "We fought because we had no choice. What happens next is what will determine the fate of the world." Robert snorted, though it lacked his usual bravado. "What happens next? Next, we drink, we feast, and we bloody rest. The dead are gone, Valyrian. You've done your part." Varros turned his fiery gaze to Robert, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "The dead are gone," he agreed, his tone carrying a hint of warning. "But the living are far from united. You know it as well as I do, Robert Baratheon. The dragons won't return to slumber, and the fires of Valyria won't fade. What happens next will depend on who has the strength to shape the future." Daenerys glanced at the dragons, then back at Varros, her expression thoughtful. "The world has seen the might of old Valyria today," she said softly, "and it will never forget." Ned, his gaze lingering on Jon, finally spoke. "What of Jon? What role does he play in this future you speak of?" Varos turned to Jon, who had risen to his feet beside him. For a moment, the sorcerer said nothing, his fiery eyes studying the young man. Finally, he answered, "Jon Snow is more than he seems. His blood is tied to the fire, his destiny intertwined with the dragons. He will find his path, Stark. That much I know." The tension between the gathered leaders was palpable, a fragile mix of relief for the victory won and unease for what lay ahead. The power of the dragons and the resurgence of Valyrian might were undeniable, and though the dead had been defeated, the living now faced an uncertain and tumultuous future. As the cheers of the soldiers echoed around them, Varos looked back at Maelstrom and Scourge. His voice dropped to a murmur, just loud enough for Jon to hear. "This was but the first step, Jon Snow. The flames of Valyria have been reignited, and the world will burn before it is reborn." As the celebrations of victory slowly subsided, Varos walked alongside Daenerys Targaryen through the encampment of Valyrian troops, their red and black banners fluttering in the cold wind. The soldiers bowed their heads respectfully as their commander passed, the aura of reverence around him undeniable. The glow of the fires that still burned across the battlefield reflected in his eyes, which flickered with an intensity that spoke of plans already forming in his mind. Daenerys, regal and composed, kept pace with him, her violet eyes scanning the camp and the remnants of the battle. The weight of what had just occurred, the fall of the Night King, the power of the dragons, and the unity of the living hung heavily in the air. But as they moved through the rows of soldiers, Varos leaned closer to her, his voice low and measured. "Jon Snow," he began, his tone carrying a quiet gravity. "He is not just a Stark bastard. He is of old Valyria." Daenerys glanced at him sharply, her expression a mixture of surprise and intrigue. "What do you mean?" "Jon has never shown any connection to Valyria. His blood is Stark." Varos's lips curved into a faint smile, his fiery eyes narrowing slightly. "His blood is Stark, yes, but there is more. You saw it yourself, Daenerys. The bond with Scourge, the way the dragon obeyed him, fought for him, as though they were one. That is not something that can be learned. It is something that is born." Daenerys' steps faltered for a moment, her thoughts racing. "Are you saying Jon is a Targaryen? One of mine?" Varos tilted his head, his voice softening. "Perhaps, or perhaps something more. The Lord of Light's flames do not reveal everything, but they whisper truths when the time is right. What I do know is this: Jon Snow is tied to Valyria, to the dragons, and to the fires that will shape the world to come." As they walked, Varos's tone became more conspiratorial. "I will speak to Lord Stark," he said. "I will ask him to allow Jon to accompany me as a diplomatic liaison for Westeros. The East calls to us now, Daenerys. We must return to Astapor immediately. There are matters in the East that require our attention." Daenerys frowned, her mind already trying to piece together his intentions. "The East? What business do we have in Astapor? The Night King is gone. Westeros is where our focus must be." Varos stopped and turned to face her fully, his expression calm but firm. "The dead may be gone, but the living will not remain united for long. You saw it in Robert's eyes, in Stark's unease. They fear the dragons, and they fear what Valyria has become. Westeros will be ours in time, but to ensure that future, we must secure the East. The forces gathering there are not loyal to you, not yet. Astapor is just the beginning." Daenerys met his gaze, her own resolve hardening. "You mean to consolidate power?" Varos nodded, his fiery eyes unwavering. "The Lord of Light has shown me glimpses of what is to come. The East will be crucial in what lies ahead, and Jon Snow is tied to this, whether he knows it or not. He must come with us. He is part of the flames." Daenerys hesitated, her thoughts conflicting. "Jon, he is loyal to his family, to the north. Which is why I will ask Eddard Stark myself," Varos said, his voice tinged with quiet confidence. "Lord Stark will not refuse when he understands what is at stake. Jon is more than a bastard of Winterfell. He is a bridge between worlds, between fire and ice. and we will need him in the battles to come." Daenerys studied him for a long moment, her mind weighing the risks and rewards of his plan. Finally, she nodded. "If Jon is to come with us, then you must ensure he knows the truth about his blood, if there is truth to what you say." Varos's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "The truth will reveal itself when the time is right. For now we prepare. The flames call us east. Daenerys, let us not keep them waiting." As they continued to walk among the Valyrian troops, their conversation grew quiet, their plans solidifying in the shadows of victory. The battle with the Night King had been won, but the war for the future of the world had only just begun. Varos approached Robert Baratheon and his Kingsguard, the faint glow of lingering flames still reflecting in his fiery eyes. Ned Stark stood at Robert's side, his expression one of measured caution, still processing the events that had just unfolded. The battlefield had quieted, but the weight of the victory and the power displayed hung heavily in the air. The Kingsguard, their white cloaks billowing in the cold wind, stepped forward instinctively as Varos drew near. But Robert raised a hand, his expression unreadable. "Let him speak," he said, his voice gruff but curious. "The Valyrians saved us, after all." Varos stopped a few paces away, his posture calm but commanding. He glanced at Ned, then back to Robert, his tone measured but firm. "I have come to make a request of Lord Stark," he began, his words deliberate. "I would like Jon Snow to accompany me as a diplomatic liaison." The statement landed heavily, both Robert and Ned exchanging stunned glances. Robert's brow furrowed, his grip tightening on the warhammer slung over his shoulder. "A diplomatic liaison? With you? For what purpose?" he demanded, his voice edged with suspicion. Ned, ever cautious, stepped forward, his tone calm but wary. "You've seen what my son has done today. He has fought bravely, but this request is unusual." "What do you intend, Varos?" Varos turned his fiery gaze to Ned, his expression unreadable. "Jon Snow has a part to play in what is to come, Lord Stark. His actions today prove that he is more than just a bastard of Winterfell. The dragons recognize him, as do the flames. He is tied to something greater." Ned's eyes narrowed slightly, his voice steady. "And what is this greater purpose you speak of?" Varos glanced at Robert before returning his focus to Ned. "The battle with the dead is over, but the world is far from safe. The flames of Valyria have reignited, and the East calls to us. There are matters there that must be addressed, forces that will shape the future of Westeros and beyond. Jon Snow is a bridge between fire and ice, and his presence is vital." Robert, his face a mixture of confusion and irritation, barked, "The East? What business do you have in the East, Valyrian? We just fought the bloody apocalypse, and now you want to take Ned's boy off to God's nowhere?" Varos's voice remained calm, but there was a weight to his words that silenced even Robert's protests. "The East is not just a distant land, Your Grace. It is where the fires burn brightest, and where alliances will be forged that will determine the fate of this realm. If Westeros is to survive the trials to come, we must ensure that the East is prepared. Jon Snow will serve as a symbol of unity, a Stark among dragons." Ned crossed his arms, his eyes fixed on Varos. "You ask much of a father. Jon is my son, no matter his birth. Why should I trust that this is for his good?" Varos stepped closer, his fiery gaze softening slightly. "Because Jon is destined for more than the North, Lord Stark. He has already proven his mettle, his bond with the dragons, his willingness to fight for the living. This is not the end of his journey. It is the beginning." Robert, though still uneasy, let out a grudging laugh. "A Stark among dragons? Sounds like madness. But then again, what hasn't been madness these days?" Ned remained silent for a long moment, his thoughts clearly weighing heavily on him. Finally, he turned to Jon, who had just approached from the rear, his expression curious but cautious. "Jon," Ned said quietly, "this man believes your place is with him in the East. What do you think?" Jon looked between Varos, Robert, and his father, his voice steady but unsure. "I don't know what my place is, Father, but I trust you. If you believe I should go, I'll follow." Ned's expression softened, and he nodded. Turning back to Varos, he spoke firmly. "You'll have him, Valyrian, but I expect my son to be treated with respect and honor, and I expect to hear word of him." Varos inclined his head slightly, a faint smile playing on his lips. "He will be safe in my care, Lord Stark. I give you my word." Robert grunted, waving a hand dismissively. "Fine, take the boy, but don't come crying to me if he gives you a headache, Valyrian. Starks are stubborn like that." Varos smirked faintly, then turned to Jon. "Prepare yourself. We leave for Astapor immediately. There are fires that demand our attention." As Varos departed to make preparations, Daenerys watched from a distance, her expression unreadable. The dragons had saved Westeros today, but the unease lingered, of power wielded, of alliances forged, and of the unknown future that lay ahead in the east. As the battlefield cleared and the living forces began to regroup, Oberyn Martell, bloodied and battered but unbroken, approached Varos. His crimson armor was scratched and dented. His spear darkened with the remnants of the battle. He stopped just short of Varos, his sharp eyes burning with determination. The Dornish prince gripped his weapon tightly, standing tall despite the wear of the fight. "I will join you in the east," Oberyn said, his voice firm despite his exhaustion. "You may command dragons, Valyrian, but there are dangers that even fire cannot destroy. You'll need someone who understands the shadows and how to navigate them." Varos turned to Oberyn, his fiery eyes studying the Dornish warrior. For a moment, he said nothing, letting the weight of Oberyn's words settle. Then, with a faint smirk, he nodded. "Your spear will be welcome, Prince of Dorne. The East is no stranger to blood and fire." Oberyn inclined his head, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Good. Let us see if the East is ready for Dorne." As Varos departed with Daenerys and his Valyrian forces, the dragons circling ominously overhead, Ned Stark and Robert Baratheon stood apart from the celebrations, speaking quietly. Their expressions were grave, the weight of the recent victory overshadowed by the questions left unanswered. Robert, still gripping his warhammer, glanced at the retreating figures of Varos and Daenerys. His jaw tightened and he muttered, "That Valyrian must be watched, Ned. He's too powerful, too dangerous." Ned, ever the voice of reason, nodded slowly. "I don't disagree, Robert. His power saved us today, but power like that, it doesn't come without a cost." Robert grunted, his gaze darkening. "A man like that doesn't save the world out of the goodness of his heart. He's planning something. I can feel it." "And Daenerys?" Ned asked, his tone measured. "She stands beside him. What of her?" Robert's expression hardened. "She's always been a problem, but now, with dragons and that Valyrian sorcerer at her side, she's a problem we can't ignore." "What do you propose?" Ned asked, though he already suspected the answer. "I want spies," Robert said bluntly, his voice low but firm. "Spread them across the east. Astapor, Meereen, Volantis, anywhere they might go. I want eyes on them every step of the way. We need to know what they're planning, Ned." Ned frowned, his discomfort clear. "Spying on allies? It's a dangerous game, Robert." "Dangerous?" Robert snapped, turning to face Ned fully. "You saw what that man did today. You saw the dragons. If he decides Westeros isn't worth keeping, what's to stop him from burning it all to ash? No, Ned, we can't trust him. We can't trust her. We need to stay ahead of them." Ned sighed, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "I'll send word to my bannermen in the east. If they hear anything, I'll make sure we know." "Good," Robert said, his tone softening slightly. "We've survived the dead, Ned. Now we need to survive the living. And that Valyrian sorcerer might just be the most dangerous man alive." As the two men stood in quiet contemplation, the faint roars of dragons echoed in the distance, a reminder of the power that had saved them, and the power that now threatened to reshape the world.